The execution wheel turned slowly in the fog-drenched dawn, its wooden spokes still stained with the blood of yesterday's condemned. In 16th century Nuremberg, justice wore many faces, but none more terrifying than the executioners. Franz Schmidt stood as the city's most prolific dealer of death, and on this morning in 1584, another soul would meet their end beneath the crushing weight of medieval brutality. The prisoner's name was Heinrich Schwalb, a horse thief whose crimes had sealed his fate months before in the cold chambers of Nuremberg's courts. He was 28 years old, with matted brown hair that fell across his hollow cheeks, his lean frame reduced to sinew and bone after weeks in the dungeon's darkness. His gray tunic hung loose on his shoulders, torn at the sleeves, crusted with the filth of imprisonment. As the guards dragged him through the cobblestone streets toward the execution ground, his bare feet scraped against the stones, leaving thin trails of blood that glistened in the early light. The crowd gathered like carrion birds, their faces a mixture of righteous anger and morbid fascination. Children perched on their fathers' shoulders. Merchants closed their stalls to witness justice. The execution ground stood on a raised platform outside the city walls, where the wooden wheel had been mounted horizontally on a thick oak post, its rim studded with iron brackets. Franz Schmidt waited beside it, a tall man in his early 30s with a dark beard and emotionless gray eyes, dressed in black leather that creaked with every movement. In his massive hands, he held the braking iron a heavy wagon wheel spoke, thick as a man's wrist, worn smooth from years of shattering bone. Heinrich was stripped to the waist, his pale skin already bruised purple and yellow from the torturer's preliminary work. They bound his wrists and ankles to iron rings hammered into the platform, stretching his body across the wheel's surface so that his limbs extended along the spokes, exposed and vulnerable. The priest finished his final prayers, words swallowed by the wind, and stepped back. The crowd fell silent. Franz Schmidt raised the braking iron above his head, and for one eternal moment the world held its breath. The first blow came down on Heinrich's right shin, with a sound like a branch snapping in winter. The bone shattered instantly, fragments pressing into muscle and flesh, and Heinrich's scream tore through the morning air, raw, primal, a sound that made mothers cover their children's ears. But the wheel demanded more. Franz moved with methodical precision, a craftsman at his trade, bringing the iron down on Heinrich's left shin, then his right thigh, each impact accompanied by the wet crack of breaking bone and the victim's howls of agony. Blood began to pool beneath the wheel, dripping through the spokes onto the platform below. Heinrich's face had turned the color of ash, his mouth frozen open in an endless scream, his eyes rolled back until only the whites showed. Sweat poured from his body despite the morning chill, mixing with blood and urine as his body betrayed him in its suffering. Franz continued his terrible work, the left thigh, then both forearms, each strike delivered with the same measured force, enough to pulverize bone without killing quickly. The condemned man's body began to look less human with each blow, limbs bent at impossible angles, flesh swelling purple and black around the impact points. The final strikes came to Heinrich's upper arms and collarbone, and by then his screams had faded to broken whimpers, his vocal cords shredded from crying out to a god who did not answer. Franz Schmidt stepped back, breathing heavily from exertion, and surveyed his work with the dispassion of a butcher examining meat. Heinrich lay broken across the wheel, every major bone in his limbs destroyed, his body a twisted mockery of the human form, but he was still alive. This was the wheel's true cruelty, not the breaking, but what came after. The guards began to weave Heinrich's shattered limbs through the spokes of the wheel, threading his ruined arms and legs between the wooden bars like a grotesque bastetwork. Each movement sent fresh waves of agony through his destroyed nervous system, his body jerking involuntarily, fresh blood seeping from compound fractures, where bone had pierced skin. When they finished, his body formed a horrific wheel of flesh, limbs bent backward and forward, in ways nature never intended. They hoisted the wheel upright and mounted it atop the tall post, where Heinrich would be displayed as a warning to all who passed. From his elevated position, Heinrich could see the entire city of Nuremberg. Spread before him the red-tiled roofs, the church spires reaching toward heaven, the marketplace where he'd once walked as a free man. But freedom was a memory now, as distant as childhood. The sun climbed higher, burning his exposed skin, while crows began to circle overhead, attracted by the scent of blood and approaching death. His broken body screamed with every breath, every heartbeat sending fresh torrents of pain through shattered nerves. Minutes stretched into hours, hours into an eternity of suffering. Franz Schmidt had returned to his home by midday, washing the blood from his hands in a wooden basin, recording the execution in his journal with neat, careful handwriting. "Broke on the wheel a horse thief named Heinrich Schwalb," he wrote. "Died after 6 hours." To Franz, it was simply another entry in a career that would span 45 years and claim over 400 lives. He felt neither pride nor shame, only the quiet satisfaction of duty fulfilled. The law had been served. The city was safer. This was justice, as men of that age understood it. But on the wheel, Heinrich Schwalb still clung to life, his consciousness flickering like a candle in a storm. Thirst consumed him more than pain now, his swollen tongue filling his mouth, his lips cracked and bleeding. Flies gathered on his wounds, laying eggs in torn flesh. The crowd had dispersed hours ago, returning to their lives, their dinners, their warm beds. He hung alone beneath the indifferent sky, a broken monument to humanity's capacity for calculated cruelty. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the clouds blood red, Heinrich's heart finally surrendered. His last breath escaped as a sigh, barely audible, a whisper of release. They left his body on the wheel for 3 days, as was custom, a rotting scarecrow meant to frighten would-be criminals. Birds pecked at his eyes. Rain washed some of the blood away. Children dared each other to throw stones at the corpse, laughing nervously at their own bravery. When they finally took him down, what remained barely resembled anything that had once walked and talked and dreamed. They buried him in unconsecrated ground outside the city walls, in a shallow grave marked by nothing, his name forgotten by all but the executioner's meticulous records. Franz Schmidt would go on to break 38 more men on the wheel during his long career, each execution performed with the same methodical precision, the same absence of emotion. He considered himself a craftsman, not a monster, a servant of law and order in a world that demanded harsh examples. In his later years, he would be pardoned of the hereditary dishonor that came with the executioner's trade, granted respectability in recognition of his long service. He died in his bed at age 74, surrounded by family, his conscience apparently untroubled by the screams that had defined his life's work. But the wheel endures in memory as one of history's most sadistic inventions, a machine designed not simply to kill, but to maximize suffering, to transform a human being into a public spectacle of agony. It reminds us that justice and cruelty often walked hand in hand in the medieval world, that the line between righteous punishment and sadistic torture was drawn by men who valued order above mercy. Heinrich Schwalb was no hero, just a thief who made fatal choices. Yet the manner of his death reveals something darker about the society that condemned him, that civilization is a thin veneer, and beneath it, we are all capable of watching monsters work while calling it righteousness. The execution grounds of Nuremberg are long gone now, paved over by progress and time. But if you stand in certain spots outside the old city walls and listen carefully to the wind, some say you can still hear them. The echoes of breaking bones, the screams of the condemned, the slow creak of the wheel turning in the fog. History doesn't bury its sins, it just waits for us to forget. If this story made you think, don't look away. Like, share, and subscribe for more dark truths buried beneath history's blood-stained pages, because the past isn't dead, it's still warning us.